What is this? This is completely acceptable. You're fired.
Go mop the floors.
Madam Chairman, is everything all right?
Go mop the floors. The words echoed across the marble lobby, not because they were loud, not because they were clever, but because everyone who heard them understood exactly what they meant. The manager stood behind the front desk, with his arms folded across his chest. A small smile rested on his face, the kind of smile that appeared when someone believed they had complete control over a room. The woman standing in front of him looked at the bucket sitting against the wall. Then she looked back at him. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even look offended. Instead, she smiled. A calm smile, a patient smile, the kind of smile that often makes confident people nervous. But Richard Harlow wasn't nervous. Not yet. Because Richard Harlow had spent most of his life believing he could judge people within seconds. And most of the time, nobody challenged him. 30 minutes later, he would learn how expensive that habit could become. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to remember one thing. The most dangerous mistakes are often the ones people make with complete confidence. Richard wasn't confused. He wasn't uncertain. He wasn't guessing. He truly believed he knew exactly who this woman was, and that certainty was about to destroy everything he had spent 12 years building. Stay with me until the end, because the final conversation in this story left an entire boardroom silent, and what happened afterward changed hundreds of employees' lives. The story begins on a rainy Tuesday morning. The Grand Regency Hotel sat in the center of downtown Chicago. It wasn't just another hotel. It was one of the most expensive properties in the city. Professional athletes stayed there. Movie stars stayed there. Business executives held meetings there. The lobby looked more like a museum than a hotel. Tall glass walls stretched toward the ceiling. Huge chandeliers hung above polished marble floors. Fresh flowers were delivered every morning. Everything was designed to impress. Everything except the people who worked there. At least that was how many employees felt. Richard Harlow had been the general manager for almost 6 years. On paper, his record looked impressive. Revenue had increased. Bookings had grown. Corporate headquarters regularly praised his numbers, but numbers only told part of the story. Employees had a different opinion. Most workers respected his position. Very few respected the man. Richard believed appearances revealed everything. Expensive suit, successful. Luxury watch, important. Designer handbag, valuable customer. Simple clothes, probably staff. He never admitted this openly. He didn't have to. His actions spoke for him. The front desk employees knew it. The security guards knew it. The housekeeping department knew it better than anyone. People learned quickly that Richard treated some individuals differently than others. The difference wasn't subtle. It was obvious. At 8:12 that morning, Richard stood behind the front desk reviewing reports. The hotel was preparing for an important visit later that day. Corporate representatives were expected. Nobody knew exactly who was coming, only that the visit mattered. Richard wanted everything perfect. Every employee had received instructions. Every department had been warned. Every detail had been inspected twice. The weather outside was miserable. Rain hammered against the glass entrance. Guests hurried inside carrying umbrellas. Employees rushed through their morning tasks. Then the front doors opened. A woman stepped inside. She appeared to be in her early 60s. Her dark coat was simple. Her shoes were practical. Her handbag looked old. There was nothing flashy about her. Nothing expensive. Nothing that attracted attention. At least not the kind of attention Richard noticed. She paused near the entrance. For a moment she simply looked around, studying the lobby, watching the employees, observing the guests. A young bellhop rushed past carrying luggage. She smiled at him. The bellhop smiled back. Then I continued working. The woman walked slowly toward the front desk. Richard glanced up. His eyes moved across her clothing, her shoes, her coat, her handbag. 3 seconds. That was all it took. His decision was already made. Not important. The woman reached the desk. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Good morning," replied the receptionist. The woman smiled. "Busy day? A little busier than usual." The woman nodded. She seemed genuinely interested. "How long have you worked here?" The receptionist looked surprised. "Almost 3 years. Do you enjoy it?" The question felt unusual. Most guests never asked. The receptionist hesitated, then smiled politely. "Most days." The woman laughed softly. "That's an honest answer." Before the conversation could continue, Richard stepped forward. "Can we help you with something?" His tone was professional. "But it's cold." The woman turned toward him. "Possibly." Richard waited. The woman looked around the lobby again. "Beautiful hotel. Thank you. How many employees work here?" Richard frowned slightly. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, curiosity." The answer seemed to irritate him. The morning was busy. He had reports to review. Executives arriving, inspections underway. He didn't have patience for random questions. The woman continued. "The housekeeping team must work very hard." Richard shrugged. "They do their jobs." The woman studied his expression. That didn't sound very appreciative. The receptionist immediately looked down. Richard's smile tightened. "I think our employees are compensated fairly." The woman nodded slowly. "Interesting." That single word hung between them. Interesting. Not agreement, not criticism, just observation. For some reason, Richard disliked it immediately. The woman looked toward a housekeeper pushing a cleaning cart through the lobby. The employee smiled politely while passing. The woman smiled back. Then she turned toward Richard. "How long have you been a manager?" 6 years. "That's a lot of responsibility." "It is." Again she nodded. Again. She seemed to be studying him. Richard suddenly felt as if he were being interviewed. He didn't like the feeling. Not at all. Then something happened. A small child accidentally dropped a cup near the entrance. Orange juice spilled across part of the floor. The child's mother looked embarrassed. A nearby employee quickly moved toward the spill. Before anyone could react, Richard pointed toward the mess, then pointed toward the woman, and said the words that would eventually cost him everything. "Go mop the floors." The receptionist froze. The bellhop stopped walking. A security guard looked over. Richard wasn't finished. He smiled. "If you're going to stand around asking questions, at least make yourself useful." Silence filled the lobby. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The woman looked at the spill. Then I looked at Richard. For 3 seconds, neither person said anything. The employee arriving with cleaning supplies slowed down. Waiting, watching. Everyone was watching. The woman finally smiled. "That's an interesting assumption," Richard laughed. "No, it's a reasonable one." The woman nodded. "Perhaps." Then she stepped aside, allowing the housekeeper to clean the spill. The employee looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. The woman noticed. She gently touched the employee's arm. "It's all right." The housekeeper nodded. But her expression suggested otherwise. Richard shook his head, clearly satisfied with himself. The woman thanked the employee cleaning the floor. Then she turned and walked away. No anger, no argument, no scene, nothing. And somehow that bothered Richard even more. Because people who are embarrassed usually show it. People who are upset usually react. This woman simply walked away, like she already knew something he didn't. What Richard didn't know was that several employees had witnessed everything, and every one of them would remember those words, "Go mop the floors," because within the next 30 minutes, those 5 words would become famous inside the Grand Regency Hotel, and the woman he had just insulted would become the most important person in the building, without anyone realizing it yet. Not even Richard. The woman walked away from the front desk as if nothing unusual had happened. She moved at an easy pace, neither fast nor slow. The lobby around her slowly returned to life, but several employees kept glancing toward Richard. They had seen him embarrass people before. Yet something about this moment felt different. Meanwhile, Richard Harlow was still standing behind the front desk. 2 assistant managers had joined him. "Everything looks good," one assistant manager said. "It should," Richard replied. "We've spent a week preparing." The second manager glanced toward the woman walking near the elevators. Who was she? Richard laughed. "No idea." Some people wander into places they don't belong. He dismissed her entirely, because Richard was focused on one thing, the impending corporate visit. 3 weeks earlier, the Regency Hospitality Group had been quietly acquired by a private holding company. A new chairwoman had just taken over the entire portfolio. She was notoriously private. No press releases featuring her face. No corporate portraits hanging in the back offices. Richard didn't know what she looked like, and he didn't care. He only cared about impressing the transition team arriving today. While Richard polished his perfect image in the lobby, the woman bypassed the luxury. She didn't wander aimlessly. She moved with purpose. She walked the back hallways guests never saw. She stopped near a young housekeeper arranging fresh flowers. The employee looked completely exhausted. "Long day already?" the woman asked warmly. The housekeeper hesitated, looking around nervously before lowering her voice. "Some days are harder than others." The woman noticed the hesitation. She noticed the fear. Over the next 20 minutes, she didn't conduct a formal tour. She simply paid attention. She saw the frayed carpets in the staff break room. She saw the broken equipment on the maintenance carts. She spoke to a server carrying a tray meant for 2 people. Because she never wore a badge and never introduced herself, the staff spoke honestly. They didn't talk about hotel revenues. They talked about understaffing, ignored repair requests, a culture of intimidation. Whenever Richard's name came up, the reaction was always exactly the same. Voices dropped, eyes darted toward the hallway. That collective fear told her everything she needed to know. A financial spreadsheet could hide a bad manager, but the terrified staff couldn't. By 9:45, she had heard enough. She walked quietly toward the executive conference center to wait. Back in the lobby, Richard's confidence continued growing. The incident from earlier was completely forgotten. He had much more important things to focus on. The corporate visit, the presentation, the future. He smoothed his expensive suit. He checked his luxury watch. At exactly 9:58, the first sign of trouble appeared. A black SUV pulled up outside the hotel entrance. That wasn't unusual. Luxury vehicles arrived constantly. But then a second SUV arrived, then a third, then a fourth. The valet team immediately noticed. Several employees exchanged glances. Something was happening. The front doors opened. 3 executives stepped inside. Expensive suits, professional posture, corporate badges. The atmosphere changed instantly. The receptionists straightened. Managers adjusted their jackets. Security officers became more alert. Richard emerged from behind the front desk with a confident smile. Finally, the visitors had arrived. He walked toward the entrance, ready to greet them, ready to impress them, ready to demonstrate why he deserved another successful year as manager. But something strange happened. The executives barely acknowledged him. One nodded politely. Another offered a quick handshake. Then they looked past him, toward the lobby, toward the elevators. Richard frowned. The executives appeared to be searching for someone, an important someone. He quickly stepped forward. "Welcome to the Grand Regency." One executive smiled. "Thank you." Richard extended his hand. The executive shook it briefly, then checked his watch. As though waiting, still waiting, Richard felt a small knot form in his stomach. It wasn't fear, not yet, just confusion. Several more executives entered. Then another vehicle arrived, and another. Employees throughout the lobby began whispering. Nobody had expected this many corporate representatives. The reception desk phones stopped ringing. Guests slowed their pace. Even the atmosphere felt different, charged, anticipatory, like everyone was waiting for something. The woman finally returned to the lobby. She walked calmly from the hallway near the conference center. The moment she appeared, one of the executives smiled. Another immediately straightened. A third moved toward her. Richard noticed. His confusion deepened. The executives weren't waiting for an investor. They weren't waiting for a celebrity guest. They weren't waiting for a government official. They were waiting for her, the same woman he had insulted less than an hour earlier. Richard suddenly felt something cold settle in his chest. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared. The woman approached the center of the lobby. Employees watched quietly. Executives moved toward her. The distance between them closed. One executive extended his hand. His voice carried clearly through the room. "Good morning, Madam Chairman." Silence. Complete silence. A bellhop nearly dropped a luggage cart. A receptionist froze. A security officer blinked twice. Richard's face lost all color. For a moment he honestly believed he had heard wrong. Madam Chairman, not a consultant, not a visitor, not an inspector. Chairman, the highest-ranking person in the entire company. The woman he had told to mop the floors. The woman he had dismissed. The woman he had judged within 3 seconds. She shook the executive's hand warmly, then greeted the others by name, not reading badges, not guessing, by name. The executives smiled respectfully. Several even seemed nervous. And suddenly, Richard understood exactly how large his mistake had been. Because the woman standing in the center of the lobby wasn't just another executive. She wasn't simply important. She was Evelyn Brooks, chairwoman of the entire Regency Hospitality Group. The woman who ultimately had authority over every manager, every department, every employee, and every hotel in the company, including him. And as Richard stared across the lobby, one terrifying realization settled into his mind. Evelyn Brooks remembered every word he had said, every single one. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The lobby felt frozen in time. Richard Harlow stood near the front desk, with his heart pounding so hard he could hear it. Just 30 minutes earlier, he had treated Evelyn Brooks like she didn't belong in the building. Now, some of the most powerful executives in the company were standing around her, like students greeting a respected teacher. The difference was immediate. The difference was impossible to ignore. Employees who had watched the earlier exchange looked from Richard to Evelyn and back again. Several remembered his exact words. "Go mop the floors." At the time, Richard had spoken with confidence. Now those same words felt dangerous. Evelyn greeted each executive calmly. She smiled, shook hands, asked about families, asked about travel. There was nothing dramatic about her behavior. No anger, no public confrontation, no speech. And somehow that made Richard even more nervous. Because people who explode reveal their emotions. People who stay calm reveal nothing. Richard forced a smile and walked toward the group. "Madam Chairman," he said. His voice sounded different now, much softer, much more careful. Evelyn turned toward him. "Mr. Harlow." Just those 2 words. No smile, no anger, nothing. Richard suddenly wished she would yell. At least then he would know where he stood. Instead, she simply looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the executives. "Shall we begin?" One executive nodded. "The conference room is ready." Evelyn smiled. "Excellent." As the group started walking away, Richard quickly joined them. He wasn't about to let the most important visit of his career happen without him. Inside the executive conference room, tension filled the air. Not because Evelyn created it, because everyone else did. A long table stretched through the center of the room. Financial reports sat neatly organized. Presentation materials were ready. Coffee waited on a side table. Richard took his seat. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. The room fell silent. One executive opened a folder. Another prepared a tablet. Everyone appeared ready for a standard corporate review. Then Evelyn spoke. "I'd like to start differently." Several people looked up. Evelyn folded her hands. "This morning I arrived alone." Nobody interrupted. "I walked through this hotel for almost an hour. The room remained silent. I spoke with employees." Richard felt his stomach tighten. "I visited multiple departments." Another pause. "I asked questions." She looked around the table. "And I learned far more than I expected." Nobody moved. Richard suddenly became aware of how warm the room felt. Evelyn opened a notebook. The same notebook she had carried throughout the building. The same notebook she had quietly written in after every conversation. "Let's begin with employee satisfaction." An executive immediately pulled up data. Richard relaxed slightly. Numbers, reports, charts. These were familiar territories. He could handle numbers. The executive cleared his throat. "Employee retention has declined by 18% over the last 2 years." Richard quickly responded. Labor shortages have affected the entire industry. Evelyn nodded. Perhaps. Then she looked at another executive. Customer complaints? The executive checked her files. Up 22%. Richard leaned forward. Most relate to staffing challenges. Again, Evelyn nodded. Again, she simply said, perhaps. The word landed differently each time. Not agreement, not disagreement, observation. Nothing more. And somehow that made it harder to defend himself. The meeting continued. Each report revealed another problem. Staff turnover, customer dissatisfaction, department conflicts, training failures. Individually, none looked catastrophic. Together, they painted a troubling picture. Richard continued offering explanations, some reasonable, some less convincing. But Evelyn never argued. She simply listened, then asked another question, and another, and another. By noon, Richard felt exhausted. Meanwhile, outside the conference room, employees had begun talking. News traveled quickly through hotels, especially surprising news. Everyone now knew the identity of the woman from the lobby. Housekeepers discussed it during lunch breaks. Front desk staff whispered about it behind computer screens. Bellhops exchanged stories near the entrance, and one topic appeared again and again. Richard, specifically Richard's behavior. People remembered things, comments, incidents, moments they had ignored, moments they had accepted because speaking up seemed pointless. For years, employees had convinced themselves that nothing would change. Now something felt different. For the first time, someone important appeared willing to listen, and that changed everything. Shortly after lunch, Evelyn requested something unexpected. I'd like to meet with employees. Richard blinked. Department heads? No. Evelyn closed her notebook. Employees. The room went quiet. Richard forced a smile. Of course, we can arrange that. Within an hour, small groups of workers began meeting with Evelyn and the executive team. The first group included housekeeping employees. Most looked nervous. One woman barely spoke above a whisper. Another kept glancing toward the door. Evelyn noticed immediately. You don't need to be afraid. The employees exchanged uncertain looks. Then one finally spoke. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Stories emerged. Some were small, others weren't. Employees described being ignored, talked down to, dismissed. Several mentioned Richard by name. One housekeeper described reporting broken equipment multiple times. Nothing happened. Another explained how staffing shortages forced employees to work extra hours. A third described being publicly embarrassed in front of guests. Evelyn listened carefully. Every word, every detail. She took notes continuously. No interruptions, no judgment, just listening. The second group included restaurant employees. The pattern continued. Different department, same complaints, lack of respect, poor communication, fear of speaking honestly. One employee said something that made the entire room pause. Most people here aren't afraid of losing their jobs. Evelyn looked up. What are they afraid of? The employee hesitated, then answered, being punished for telling the truth. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind nobody knows how to break. Evelyn slowly wrote something in her notebook. The interviews continued throughout the afternoon. Security staff, maintenance workers, receptionists, bellhops. Every conversation added another piece to the puzzle, and with each conversation, a picture became clearer. The problem wasn't a single mistake. The problem was culture. People had stopped speaking because they believed nobody cared. That belief had spread through the building like water finding cracks in stone. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly, at 4 o'clock, something happened that changed the entire investigation. A receptionist named Angela Brooks requested a private meeting. Not with Richard, not with human resources, with Evelyn. Angela had worked at the hotel for nearly 11 years, long enough to see managers come and go, long enough to recognize patterns. When she entered the room, she carried a small folder. Nothing fancy, just a simple folder, but the way she held it suggested it mattered. A lot. Evelyn noticed immediately. Take your time. Angela nodded, then placed the folder on the table. My husband told me to throw this away. She looked down at it. I almost did. Nobody spoke. Angela opened the folder. Inside sat copies of emails, reports, complaint forms, documentation collected over several years. The room became very quiet. Evelyn leaned forward. "What is this?" Angela took a deep breath. "It's everything." The answer sounded simple, but it wasn't, because inside that folder was something Richard Harlow feared more than angry employees. Proof, real proof, written proof, proof that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding, proof that couldn't be explained away, proof that had been quietly collecting for years. And as Evelyn opened the first page, Richard felt something he hadn't felt all day. Fear, real fear, because for the first time, he wasn't worried about a bad meeting. He wasn't worried about embarrassment. He wasn't worried about criticism. He was worried about what the documents might reveal. And judging by the expression on Angela's face, the worst was still coming. Angela sat quietly while Evelyn opened the folder. The room had changed. An hour earlier, it had felt like a corporate review. Now it felt like an investigation. Nobody touched their coffee. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody looked away. Evelyn carefully removed the first document and placed it on the table. The date was 3 years old. She read silently for a moment. Then she turned to the next page, then another and another. The deeper she went, the quieter the room became. Richard sat perfectly still. He wanted to know what was inside the folder. At the same time, he didn't, because he already had a feeling, a very bad feeling. Angela folded her hands together. "I started saving copies after the second complaint disappeared." Evelyn looked up. "Disappeared?" Angela nodded. "I filed it through the proper process. Human Resources acknowledged receiving it. A few weeks later, I was told there was no record of it." Nobody spoke. The executives exchanged glances. Angela continued. "At first, I thought it was a mistake." She laughed softly. There was no humor in the sound. Then it happened again. Evelyn slowly closed the folder. "Tell me everything." Angela took a deep breath. For years, she had carried these stories. For years, she had kept copies of emails, saved documents, recorded dates, not because she planned revenge, because she stopped trusting the system. The first complaint involved a front desk employee, a young woman who had reported repeated public humiliation from a supervisor. The complaint went nowhere. The second involved a maintenance worker. The third involved scheduling practices that seemed suspicious. Every time someone spoke up, the result was almost identical. Nothing happened. Or worse, the employees suddenly found themselves receiving fewer shifts, less support, less opportunity. People learned quickly. Speaking up came with consequences. Remaining silent felt safer. Evelyn listened without interruption. The executives around her looked increasingly uncomfortable. This was no longer about one manager making rude comments. This was beginning to look like a pattern that had lasted years. Richard finally leaned forward. "I think we're making assumptions." His voice sounded calmer than he felt. Angela immediately looked at him. For the first time that day, there was no fear in her eyes, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone tired of carrying the same burden. "No," she said quietly, "we're finally talking about facts." The room fell silent again. Richard opened his mouth. Then I closed it, because arguing with her would only make things worse. Evelyn returned to the documents. Several contained email chains. Others contained written statements. One document caught her attention immediately. She read it twice, then a third time. "Richard." His stomach tightened. "Yes?" She turned the page toward him. "Do you remember this complaint?" Richard glanced down. His pulse immediately increased. He remembered. Of course he remembered. A housekeeping employee had filed concerns regarding discrimination from a department supervisor. Richard had dismissed it. Not officially, not openly, but he had encouraged Human Resources to handle it internally. Quietly, the employee eventually resigned. At the time, Richard considered the situation resolved. Now it sat in front of him again, years later, more dangerous than ever. "I vaguely remember it," he said. Angela laughed. Again that tired laugh. "You remember it." Richard looked away. Angela continued. "She cried in my office after that meeting. Nobody moved. She begged someone to listen. The room felt smaller. The executives stopped taking notes. They were simply listening now, listening to stories that should have been addressed years ago. Story after story followed. One employee described reporting misconduct. Nothing happened. Another explained being passed over repeatedly despite strong performance. Another described being warned to stop asking questions. Each story by itself seemed manageable. Together, they became impossible to ignore. Evelyn noticed something important. The same names appeared repeatedly, the same departments, the same decisions, the same outcomes. Patterns. Organizations can survive mistakes. Patterns are harder to explain, especially documented patterns. As the afternoon continued, more employees came forward. Some brought emails. Some brought notes. Some brought nothing except their memories. But once people realized they were finally being heard, they kept talking. A bellhop described watching employees quit after conflicts with management. A server described reporting concerns that never received responses. A security officer admitted something that surprised everyone. I stopped filing reports. The executive team looked up. Why? The officer shrugged. Nobody read them. Those 4 words landed heavily. Nobody read them. Not ignored, not rejected, not investigated. Simply not read. The statement revealed something deeper than poor management. It revealed hopelessness. People stop reporting problems when they stop believing solutions exist. And according to everything Evelyn was hearing, that was exactly what had happened inside the Grand Regency. By 5 o'clock, the conference room looked completely different. Stacks of paperwork covered the table. Employee statements sat in organized piles. Executives whispered among themselves. The mood had shifted dramatically. Nobody talked about profits anymore. Nobody talked about revenue. Nobody talked about occupancy rates. Because numbers suddenly seemed less important than trust, and trust appeared badly damaged. Richard felt isolated. Hours earlier, he had entered the meeting expecting praise. Now every conversation seemed connected to him. Every complaint, every email, every story. The walls felt like they were slowly closing in. Then Angela reached into her folder one final time. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, from anticipation. She removed a sealed envelope. The room immediately noticed. Evelyn noticed too. "What is that?" Angela looked at the envelope for several seconds before answering. "This is the reason I kept everything." Nobody spoke. The room became perfectly still. Even Richard leaned forward. Angela slowly slid the envelope across the table. Inside were copies of communications exchanged between multiple managers over several years, private discussions, internal recommendations, notes regarding complaints, notes regarding employee concerns, notes regarding how certain situations should be handled or avoided. Evelyn opened the envelope. Her expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for everyone to notice. One executive quietly adjusted his glasses. Another leaned closer. Richard's heart began racing because he suddenly remembered those emails. Not every word, not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand what Evelyn was reading. Enough to understand why Angela had saved them. Enough to understand that his situation had just become far more serious. Evelyn continued reading for nearly 5 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Finally, she set the papers down. Then she looked directly at Richard. For a long moment, she said nothing. That silence felt worse than any accusation, worse than anger, worse than shouting, because Richard had no idea what was coming next. Then Evelyn spoke. Her voice remained calm, measured, controlled. "Mr. Harlow." Richard swallowed. "Yes?" Evelyn folded her hands. "I have one question." The room became silent. Every executive looked up. Every employee waited. Even Angela held her breath. Evelyn's eyes never left Richard. "When exactly did you stop caring about what happened to the people who worked for you?" The question hit harder than any accusation, because it wasn't about policy. It wasn't about profits. It wasn't about procedures. It was about character. And for the first time all day, Richard had no answer, none at all. The silence that followed felt endless, and everyone in the room knew the investigation had reached a point of no return. The silence, after Evelyn's question seemed to stretch forever. Richard sat frozen in his chair. When exactly did you stop caring about what happened to the people who worked for you? The question remained hanging in the air, not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, because everyone in the room knew it was the real question, not the complaints, not the emails, not the reports. Those were symptoms. The question Evelyn had asked was about the cause. Richard cleared his throat. For the first time all day, he struggled to find words. I care about my employees. The answer sounded weak even to him. Nobody reacted. Nobody nodded. Nobody rushed to support him. Evelyn simply watched. Waiting, Richard continued. I've spent 6 years improving this hotel. Still nothing. The executives remained silent. Angela remained silent. The employees remained silent because nobody had questioned whether Richard worked hard. The problem was something else. Evelyn slowly opened another folder. This hotel has lost 37 employees in the last 18 months. She looked down at the documents. 22 specifically mentioned management issues during exit interviews. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Employee turnover happened everywhere. Everyone knew that. But hearing the actual numbers sounded different. Much different, Evelyn continued. 7 described feeling disrespected. She turned a page. 5 reported favoritism. Another page. 3 reported retaliation after raising concerns. The room remained completely still. Richard felt every eye on him. Not because he had broken a rule, because the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Evelyn closed the folder. Do you know what stands out to me? Richard didn't answer. The complaints aren't identical. She leaned back slightly. They come from different departments. Another pause. Different years. Another pause. Different employees. She folded her hands. And yet somehow they all describe the same environment. Richard looked down. The words landed harder than he expected, because deep down he knew she was right. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. Enough to make him uncomfortable. Enough to make him realize excuses were becoming harder to find. One executive spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. His name was Michael Turner, Regional Operations Director. Known throughout the company for being fair but brutally honest, he adjusted his glasses. Richard, can you explain why so many employees describe the same concerns? The question sounded simple. It wasn't. Richard searched for an answer. There will always be unhappy employees. A few executives exchanged glances. Michael nodded slowly. True. Then he pointed toward the stacks of documents. But unhappy employees don't usually generate this much evidence. The room grew even quieter. Richard suddenly realized something terrifying. Nobody was defending him. Not one person. Not even the managers who had laughed with him earlier that morning. Not even human resources. Nobody. Because evidence changes people. Evidence makes loyalty expensive. And nobody wanted to attach themselves to a sinking ship. Evelyn stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the city. Rain still covered the glass. Traffic moved below. The room watched her. She remained silent for several seconds. Then she spoke. When I first started in this company, I worked at a front desk. Several people looked surprised. Many employees knew Evelyn's title. Few knew her story. She turned toward them. I wasn't wealthy. She smiled slightly. I wasn't powerful either. The room listened carefully. I was 19 years old. She folded her arms. And every day I watched how managers treated people. Nobody moved. Evelyn's voice remained calm. Some managers inspired loyalty. She paused. Others demanded obedience. Another pause. The difference mattered. She slowly walked back toward the table. The first group built strong teams. Her eyes moved toward Richard. The second group built fear. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Because everyone understood where the conversation was heading. Evelyn stopped beside her chair. Fear works for a while. She glanced at the employee statements. It keeps people quiet. Another glance. It keeps problems hidden. She looked directly at Richard. But eventually the truth becomes too heavy to carry. The room felt charged, like a thunderstorm moments before lightning. Richard finally spoke. I made mistakes. The word surprised everyone, even himself. For the first time all day, there was no defense, no explanation, no excuse. Just admission. Evelyn nodded. Mistakes happen. Richard looked relieved. For a second, only a second. Then Evelyn continued. Calling a guest by the wrong name is a mistake. The room became silent again. Sending an email to the wrong department is a mistake. Another pause. Accidentally forgetting a meeting is a mistake. Her voice remained steady. What happened here wasn't a mistake. Richard's relief vanished immediately. Evelyn pointed toward the employee statements. This took years. Another pause. Years. The word hit like a hammer, because it was true. This wasn't one bad day, one bad decision, one misunderstanding. It was a pattern repeated over and over again. A pattern now sitting in plain view for everyone to see. Then Evelyn did something nobody expected. She picked up a copy of Angela's documents, slowly, carefully. Then she read one sentence aloud. Employees need to understand their place. The room froze. Richard recognized the words immediately. His words, written years earlier in an internal email. Words he barely remembered writing. Words he never expected to hear again. Evelyn lowered the page. Did you write this? Richard stared at the table. The silence answered before he did. Finally he nodded. Yes. No excuses, no denials, just yes. Evelyn placed the paper down. Then she asked another question. What exactly is an employee's place? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Evelyn continued. Is a housekeeper less valuable than a manager? Silence. Is a bellhop less important than an executive? Silence. Is a receptionist somehow worth less respect? Richard couldn't answer, because there was no good answer. Not anymore. The room waited. Then Evelyn took a slow breath, and finally delivered the moment everyone would remember. The moment employees would talk about for years. She looked directly at Richard, not angrily, not emotionally, just honestly. Do you remember what you said to me this morning? Richard felt his stomach drop. Everyone knew exactly what she meant. The lobby, the spill, the insult, the assumption. He nodded slowly. Evelyn nodded too, then repeated the words, exactly as he had spoken them. Go mop the floors. The room went silent, not a normal silence. A painful one, the kind of silence people remember long after conversations end. Richard lowered his head, because hearing those words now sounded different, very different. Hours earlier he had spoken to them with confidence. Now they sounded cruel, small, embarrassing. Evelyn folded her hands. Do you know what bothered me most? Richard looked up. She answered before he could speak. It wasn't an insult. The room listened carefully. It wasn't even an assumption. Another pause. It was how easy it was for you. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Evelyn's eyes never left him. You didn't know who I was, she paused. You thought I was unimportant. Another pause. And because you thought I was unimportant, you believed I deserved less respect. The words landed like stones. Heavy, impossible to ignore. Evelyn looked around the room, then toward the employee statements, then back to Richard. And if that's how you treated a stranger in public, her voice remained calm. How many employees experience the same thing when nobody important was watching? The question shattered whatever defense Richard still had. Because for the first time all day, he realized this wasn't about one embarrassing moment. The lobby incident had simply exposed who he really was, and now everyone else could see it too. The room remained silent. The decision hadn't been announced yet. But deep down, everyone already knew what was coming, including Richard. Especially Richard. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Evelyn finished. The room felt completely different now. Not because people were shocked, because they understood. Every executive understood. Every employee understood. Even Richard understood. The conversation was over. Only the decision remained. Evelyn slowly gathered the documents from the table. The employee statements, the complaint records, the emails. Years of ignored warnings stacked neatly in front of her. She looked toward the executive team. Do any of you need additional information before we proceed? One by one, heads shook. No. The answer was unanimous. There was nothing left to investigate. Nothing left to clarify. The evidence had already spoken. Michael Turner folded his hands. I believe the record is clear. Another executive nodded. So do I. A third agreed. The room had reached a point where disagreement was no longer realistic. Richard sat quietly. Hours earlier, he had been preparing for praise. Now he was waiting for judgment. The contrast felt almost unreal. Evelyn looked at him. For the first time that day, there was something like sadness in her expression. Not sympathy, not forgiveness. Sadness. The sadness people feel when they realize a situation never had to become what it became. You had opportunities. Richard looked down. Many opportunities. He knew that now. Every complaint had been an opportunity. Every conversation, every warning, every employee who tried to speak. The signs had been there all along. He simply chose not to see them. Evelyn continued. People gave you chances to correct this. Her voice remained calm. They brought concerns. Another pause. They brought solutions. Another. They asked to be heard. The room remained silent. But every time someone spoke, they learned the same lesson. She glanced toward Angela. They learned nobody was listening. Angela lowered her eyes. Several employees in the room nodded slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to show they agreed. Enough to show they had lived it. Evelyn finally sat down. Then she spoke the words everyone expected. Richard Harlow. His chest tightened. As of today, your employment with Regency Hospitality Group is terminated effective immediately. Nobody reacted. No gasps. No whispers. No celebration. The decision felt inevitable. Like a train finally arriving after everyone had been waiting for hours. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Just once. Then opened them again. He looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally. Like the weight of the day had settled onto his shoulders all at once. One executive slid paperwork across the table. Another prepared the formal documentation. The process moved forward quickly, professionally, without drama. Richard signed where instructed. No arguments, no threats, no final speech. Maybe because he knew it wouldn't matter. Maybe because he finally understood. The position was gone. The authority was gone. The title was gone. And none of it had disappeared because of one mistake. It had disappeared because of years of choices. One decision at a time. One conversation at a time. One dismissal at a time. Eventually, those choices had become impossible to ignore. When the paperwork was finished, Richard stood. Nobody stopped him. Nobody insulted him. Nobody humiliated him. Evelyn never believed in revenge. She believed in accountability. There was a difference. Richard picked up his jacket, then hesitated. For a moment, it looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe apologize, maybe explain, maybe defend himself one last time. Instead, he simply nodded, then walked toward the door. The room watched him leave. When the door finally closed behind him, nobody spoke. The silence felt different this time. Lighter, cleaner, like a storm had finally passed. But Evelyn wasn't finished, not even close, because removing one manager wasn't enough. Not if the culture remained the same. Not if employees still felt afraid. Not if people still believed speaking up was useless. She stood and addressed the room. Bring everyone together. An executive looked surprised. Everyone? Evelyn nodded. Everyone. Within an hour, employees from every department gathered in the hotel's largest conference hall. Housekeepers, bellhops, maintenance workers, receptionists, servers, security staff, managers. Nearly 200 people filled the room. Nobody knew exactly what was about to happen. Rumors had spread all afternoon. Everyone knew Richard was gone. Everyone knew something major had happened, but nobody knew what came next. Evelyn stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. No spotlight, no dramatic music, just a woman standing behind a microphone. The room became silent. She looked across the crowd at faces young and old, new employees, veterans, people who had spent years in the company, people who had only recently arrived. Then she smiled, a genuine smile, and began speaking. When I arrived this morning, many of you had no idea who I was. A few people laughed softly, including some of the employees who had spoken with her. Evelyn nodded. That was intentional. The room listened carefully. For years I visited properties this way. People exchanged curious looks. I didn't arrive with an announcement. She paused. I didn't arrive with an escort. Another pause, and I didn't arrive expecting special treatment. The room remained silent, because the easiest way to learn the truth about an organization is to see how people behave when they think nobody important is watching. Those words landed deeply. Employees nodded. Some looked down. Others looked thoughtful. Evelyn continued. This morning I learned many things. She looked toward the housekeeping section. I met people who work incredibly hard. Toward the front desk. I met people who cared deeply about guests. Toward maintenance. I met people solving problems every day without recognition. Then her expression became serious. But I also met people who felt unheard. The room became quiet again. People who stopped reporting problems. Another pause. People who stopped expecting change. Another. People who began believing their voices didn't matter. Nobody moved. Because many people in the room knew exactly what she meant. They had lived it. Evelyn looked across the crowd, then made an announcement nobody expected. Effective immediately, a new employee advocacy office would be created. Complaints would bypass local management entirely. Anonymous reporting systems would be introduced. Employee review panels would be established. Leadership evaluations would include staff feedback. Promotions would be tied not only to performance, but also to respect. The room listened carefully. Some employees looked shocked. Others looked emotional. A few simply stared, as if they weren't sure whether to believe what they were hearing. Evelyn smiled. I don't expect trust to return overnight. She shook her head. Trust isn't given. A pause. It's earned. The room remained silent, and earning it starts today. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone began clapping. One person, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. Applause filled the hall. Employees stood. Some smiled. Some cried. Some simply clapped harder than anyone else. Not because everything was fixed, because for the first time in a long time, they felt seen. When the applause finally settled, Evelyn stepped away from the microphone, then stopped. There was one final thing she wanted to say. The most important thing. She turned back toward the crowd. Her voice was quieter now, but somehow stronger. When I walked into this building this morning, someone looked at my clothes. The room immediately understood. Someone looked at my age. Another pause. Someone made a decision about my value before learning my name. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Evelyn smiled softly. But here's the truth. The room waited. The easiest way to learn who someone really is isn't by watching how they treat their boss. Silence. It isn't by watching how they treat powerful people. Another pause. It's by watching how they treat the person they believe has no power. The room remained perfectly still. Those words settled over the crowd like a final lesson. Simple, clear, impossible to misunderstand. Evelyn stepped away from the microphone. This time she didn't stop. The applause returned, louder than before. As employees stood and clapped, many realized they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Not because a manager lost his job, not because an executive visited, but because they had witnessed something rare. A moment when respect mattered more than status, when character mattered more than position, when assumptions finally met consequences, and long after the conference hall emptied, long after the paperwork was completed, and long after the story spread throughout the company, one sentence continued, following people everywhere. The easiest way to learn who someone really is isn't by watching how they treat powerful people. It's by watching how they treat the person they believe has no power. Because dignity isn't something a title gives you, and it isn't something a title can take away. It belongs to everyone, whether the room recognizes it or not. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. And if you've ever seen someone judged before they were truly known, share your experience below. Because sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths.